you were having funerals over Zoom. And think about what I just said about Shiva. Normally in Shiva, people sit together and they have that synchrony from praying and swaying together, and they cover their mirrors so they don't see each other. Well, when you're on Zoom, your face is right in front of you, right? And so the question is, when we have to adapt the ways that these rituals have been done because of changes to the system that we can't control, this is where science can actually help religion. I have a friend who's a rabbi, and he says to me, I want to know what science says about which of these practices and how I can adapt them will make them work better, because we were just flying by the seat of our pants, and they had to, right? We all had to during COVID. But I think it's an opportunity for science and religion to work together.
Hello, welcome back to Cambridge Forum, coming to you live via Zoom on this splendid September day and the start of our new fall season. I'm Mary Stack, the Executive Director, and today, in a world teeming with questions and uncertainty, we're going to zone in on the subject of spirituality. David DeSteno, a psychologist at Northeastern University, studies the mind's foundation for moral behavior, and he's been looking at the science behind the benefits of religion. His research suggests that people who engage in spiritual practices and rituals, regardless of faith, tend to live longer and happier lives. Well, for some people, this provides sufficient proof that God works, whereas others, more skeptical people might well ask, well, what's the science behind this? And can one not enjoy the benefits by just going through the motions of ritual without buying into the whole belief system? We're raising these questions at a time when a growing body of Americans are losing faith in organized religion. Of those who say they believe in God, less than half belong to a church, synagogue, or mosque. Despite this, we remain a hungry nation, voraciously searching for answers to the big philosophical questions. The internet is bursting with podcasts and books offering new routes to mindfulness and endless suggestions for how to lead a happier, more meaningful life. Yet for millennia, people have turned to shamans, rabbis, priests, and imams to help them deal with the big challenges of life: grief, loss, birth, death, morality, and meaning. In his book, DeSteno shows how numerous religious practices and rituals have helped people through these issues and also improved their emotional and physical health. In the book, he says, when it comes to thinking about how to help people through life's travails, we scientists shouldn't be starting from scratch. When it comes to managing the human experience, it would be strange if thousands of years of religion didn't have much to offer. In the repetition of prayer, stillness in contemplation, joining of hands in celebration or sorrow, dancing and singing. To ignore that body of knowledge is to slow the progress of science itself and limits its potential benefit to humanity. Well, welcome, David.
Hi, Mary. Thanks for having me on. I'm very grateful to be with you today.
Okay, your book deftly combines science and spirituality, which is not too easy to do. You say that you don't have to be religious to benefit from the treasure trove of wisdom that you say religion offers us, since many of the tools work on the mind outside of belief. So in essence, regardless of the underlying theology, religious rituals work. Even though you also say there is no test for the fingerprint of God. So my question is, are we not just playing tricks on the mind, and does it not fuel the agnostic argument?
I don't think so. I think one of the big problems we face is the tension between science and religion. Then, that tension has had its vicissitudes over time. But at this moment in time, we're looking at a tension that's been exacerbated, especially by folks in the new atheist movement, to say all of religion is a folly. And what I like to say is, just as ancient doesn't always mean wise, neither does it always mean naive. And I think it would be hubristic of scientists, social scientists like myself, I'm not saying we're going to learn anything about the nature of the universe from religion, to ignore a huge body of knowledge that was designed to focus on helping people. Now, let me make clear, I'm not an apologist for religion. Religion can clearly cause problems. But the way I think about it, to get to your question, is these aren't tricks on the mind. I think of them more as tools or strategies or life hacks, to use a common term. In some ways, that's what psychologists do all the time. A lot of our work, and if you go to Amazon or Barnes and Noble, you'll see lots of books with tricks that you can do to make yourself happier, improve your health, make you sleep better, find connection to people. The argument that I'm making is a lot of the elements of religious ritual, if we put theology aside, and I'm not saying theology is not important, belief in a higher power has its own benefits. But if we put that to the side and we stop arguing about theology, which I think is where we tend to get to our corners and yell at each other, just like Democrats and Republicans, atheists and people of faith. Let's not ask that question. Science cannot answer whether or not God exists. Even atheism is a belief, in the sense, on faith, that probability favored us in this corner of the universe. Because we can't answer that, let's not argue about it. Let's look at what we can do together. And there it's looking at, which we'll talk about in a few minutes, parts of rituals and the way they leverage aspects of our physiology, of our mind, to help us deal with grief, become more ethical, become more compassionate, all the things that we agree on to live better lives. And so I don't think they're tricks on the mind. I think they're tools. Now, you can think of these tools as having resulted from some divine inspiration, or you can think of them as resulting from just thousands of years of people trying stuff out and seeing what works. And I think we have to respect each other's views on that, because again, that's something we can't answer. But you don't have to know the origin of a technology to use it. I use my iPhone. I have no idea how it was developed, yet it lets me connect with people all over the world. And the argument I make in this book is, let's look at these. We've done this as a society with meditation. We know meditation decreases stress, makes people, improves their memory, lowers their blood pressure. I'll talk about today how it actually increases kindness and compassion. My question is, what's the next mindfulness? There has to be something out there if we're willing to look. And this book is an attempt for me to kind of chart that across the lifespan.
So everybody can make use of it, whether you believe in something beyond the practice.
Yeah. So there are ways that you can extract elements of these. And, the trick is to always do it in a way that honors the original source. But I think of it as, if within certain prayers or certain rituals, people do certain things with their bodies, with their breath, ways they interact with each other, those elements, and you'll see them in lots of different faiths, can be abstracted and adapted and used in, non-religious contexts. To me, that is not cultural appropriation. It's not, you're not taking the prayers, you're not taking the actual symbols of a culture or a group and using them for purposes of which they were never intended. You're looking to ways that they leverage the mechanisms of our mind and our bodies. The metaphor I use in the book is, many of the medicines that we have nowadays, medicines to fight cancer and some others, were discovered by scientists going to indigenous cultures and looking for traditional cures. And sure, a lot of them didn't work, but some did. That was called bioprospecting. My argument is, let's religio-prospect. Let's go and look for practices that have been designed to help people with grief, to help people through transitions to adulthood, to help them, parents bond to children, and see if we can adapt those. And what got me down this road is a lot of the things that I've been running a psychology lab for 30 years. A lot of the things that I see myself and my colleagues discover, when I look around, I see them already being used in rituals and spiritual practices the world over. Now, sure, those people who developed them couldn't scan your brain and they couldn't run randomized controlled trials to see if these things worked. Yet they've assembled them into packages in ways that we can now science explain why they work. But that means there's probably a lot else out there that we should be looking at and examining. So we're not starting from scratch, as you said.
So in talking about these various fields and denominations and cultures, that utilize certain practices that you say benefit us.
Mm-hmm.
Can you talk us through a few of those?
Sure. One example that I like to start with is, something that unfortunately all of us face, which is losing someone, right? We all, no matter who you are in life, you're going to lose someone who is close to you, and you're going to go through a period of mourning. All religious traditions have mourning rituals. So let's look at some and see how they help us. One thing that's pretty common is the use of eulogies. Now you might say, well, Dave, yeah, of course, we always talk about what was great about the person who passed. But if you think about it, it's kind of strange. If I just lost a job that I liked or got dumped by my significant other, I wouldn't want to spend the time thinking about why that job was so great that I no longer have, or why this person who I thought was great dumped me. Thinking about that is going to increase the pain that I feel. Yet we do it all the time when somebody dies. And this is work by George Bonanno, who's one of the world's leading resilience and grief researchers. George's work shows that one of the primary predictors of moving through grief, so you don't want to deny grief, but you want to move through it in a way that it doesn't become too intense or go on too long so that it becomes paralyzing. One thing he's found is the ability to solidify positive memories of the person who has passed is the primary predictor for who can move through grief versus who gets stuck in elevated states of depression and anxiety. And so that's one way you can see the rituals working, but there's lots of others. So take the religious ritual of Shiva, if you're Jewish. Another primary predictor for moving through grief successfully is getting instrumental support. Now, what do I mean by that? It's not social support. It's not like how many followers you have on Facebook. It's who actually shows up when you need them and is there to do things for you and support you. So in Shiva, visiting the mourners, bringing them food, helping them out is a mitzvot, which means it's not something nice. It's a sacred obligation. You must do it. When you're there, groups of 10 or more Jews get together and say prayers in what's called a minyan, which is 10 people or more. Then when they do this, they will recite the prayers, often swaying and chanting together. What we know is synchronized movement together makes people feel closer to one another. We also have experimental work that if I take two people and I have them simply move in time, even just tapping their hands on a table together, not talking, not doing anything else, they will feel more similar to one another. And when I stick one of them in an unfortunate situation, the other one becomes by about 30% more likely to go and help that person. It's just an ancient marker of our purposes are joined. We see this in flocks of birds and schools of fish. It's the same thing in humans. When people cover mirrors, at Irish wakes, you'll see they'll cover mirrors, but at Shiva and certain Hindu ceremonies, they cover mirrors. It seems like an odd custom. There's scientific work showing that no matter what emotion you're feeling, if you look into a mirror, it intensifies it. So at a time of grief, if you look into a mirror, you will feel more grief, more depression, more anxiety. So covering the mirrors, even though there's a theological reason for it, it actually reduces the amount of grief people are feeling. In Shiva, people also sit on low stools or on the floor. Well, because of the way our bodies are constructed, if you do that for any extended period of time, you will get lower back pain or knee pain or leg pain, which is relieved when you get up. There's new neuroscience work that shows mild onsets and offsets of discomfort not only reduce grief, but reduce rumination, right? Something else that you do when you're grieving. And these rituals package all of these things together in an amazing way that psychologists have never done. We might give you one or two life hacks, but this is a package, where we're playing single notes, these rituals are playing symphonies. Another is, and we should talk about this now. Today is Rosh Hashanah. So the Jewish high holy days, the 10 days, the days of awe, the period between Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur, kind of signify Rosh Hashanah is the new year, and Yom Kippur is the Day of Atonement, and it kind of symbolizes the cycle of birth to death. But on both days, one of the things that happens in prayer services is people say a prayer called the Unatana Tokef. And as part of this prayer, people say, who will live, who will die before their time. In the coming year, who will die by fire, who will die by sword, who will die by flood, who will die by plague, which you might have originally thought, well, who dies by plague anymore? But unfortunately, we can see just how susceptible we all are. Why are we thinking about death on the day of the new year? Same thing with Ash Wednesday, if you're Christian or Catholic, the day before Lent. Sorry, at the start of the Lenten period, which is a time for self-reflection, much as the Jewish days of awe are. You go before the priest, who will take ashes and put them on your forehead in the sign of the cross and say, from dust you came, to dust you'll return. Now, these seem kind of morbid. Why do we do it? Well, we know that reminders of death, not that you're going to die immediately, but that death's uncertainty, that you can die, reorient people's values. It moves us from wanting to focus on our own careers, our own individual achievements, to connecting with others, to looking for opportunities to service, to doing things that are really socially meaningful. Across the lifespan, you see this happen when people get into their 60s and 70s, because at that point, your time horizon to death suddenly becomes a little more real. But it happens for people when they're even facing plagues. In the SARS epidemic in China, we saw this. What happens is, by reorienting us toward wanting to spend time with one another, to wanting to serve one another, to sacrifice, those are the true ways to find happiness. Typically research shows that when Americans want to be happier, they go and buy something, or they try and develop a new skill or something that's kind of like me, focused on me individually. And I'm not saying that's always wrong. There are certainly benefits for that, but it's not what truly brings happiness in the long run. And so what we're seeing by these rituals is, by that simple reminder, it reorients people in this time of reflection, whether it's the Jewish days of awe or the Lenten period, to reorient your values. Thomas à Kempis, the medieval Christian scholar, urged people every day to contemplate how you live your life if you were going to die that evening. And I think if we all did that, it would make life better. One other last one I'll touch on is the idea of meditation. If you read the New York Times or the Wall Street Journal or Harvard Business Review, you'll think, yeah, meditation is great. It makes you more productive at work. It reduces your stress. It increases your SAT scores. That's not why it was created. Meditation was created as a tool to reduce suffering, both your own and of all sentient beings in the wider world. And so while it does all of these other things, enhances your memory and your focus, they're all in service of allowing you to find space in your consciousness to sit with feelings that are positive and negative, and to open up that space rather than running your mind continually. And when you do that, it makes you more willing to reach out and be kind, not only to yourself, but to others. And so, we have experimental evidence where we bring people in, we put this, this idea to the test. After 8 weeks of meditation, we brought them to our lab and we said to them, we're going to test your memory in a few minutes. Why don't you just sit here in the waiting room? And so they sat in the waiting room with 2 other people who were actors who worked for us. And then we had another actor come in, and she was on crutches, fake. She didn't really need them, but she was on crutches, and she had a boot on her foot, and she was wincing in pain. The 2 actors ignored her, much as you might do if you're on the T in Boston or on the subway and not wanting to give up your comfy seat. And we thought, well, what will the person in our study do? Will they be kind to her? Will they give them her seat? Will they ask her if she needs help? Whereas only about 16% of people did this normally in the waiting room, individuals who we had randomly assigned to meditate for 8 weeks, that jumped up to 50%. That's a huge change. And so this is like a kindness technology. Lots of religions say it's good to be kind. Here's a tool to do it. And so, there's lots of others we could talk about, but the idea here is these things leverage, these tools, these practices, leverage our physiology, leverage our body, nudge our mind in certain ways to help us get the outcomes we want. So religions aren't just about, you should do this, you should believe this. But if you're engaged with those practices regularly, they give you the tools to do it, which is why the data you were pointing out in the beginning, which it's not my data, but it's data from Pew and from the Harvard Flourishing Initiative, that shows that it's not saying you believe in God that makes you happier and healthier. It's the people who regularly live the faith, who day to day engage with these practices. And I think that's the important part, right? These are the tools that make those things happen. And many of these tools can be utilized outside of their religious context to help us all.
Well, you've struck upon something quite important here, which is that there is a huge drop off in, particularly in millennials, saying they're affiliated to any kind of religion. And I wondered if you thought there was several reasons for that nationally within this country. I'm not talking about worldwide. Whether this was partly a behavioral thing of millennials, or if it was in conjunction with scandals in churches that have dropped off membership in the older age groups, or if you had any kind of theory about it.
It's dropping off among all age groups, but more so among the young. And I think, as you said in the beginning, this is the first year since Gallup first started asking this question in the 1930s that a majority of people have reported not being a member of a church, a temple, or a mosque. But the interesting thing is when these people are leaving, and we call them nones, N-O-N-E-S, meaning that they don't identify with any specific religious tradition. Most of them aren't becoming atheists. They're looking for new ways to be spiritual, right? And I think it's because they feel a need for these tools. So why are they leaving? A lot of it is institutional failures having to do with, whether it's child abuse or sexual scandals or financial scandals. Sometimes it's just, your belief system. You just can't abide by what the institution believes in terms of even gender discrimination. Women can't be priests in the Catholic Church and in other religions. But I think people are looking for new ways, and there's kind of three ways that are happening, three routes. One route is people are kind of, and this is, I think, the smallest route, but it is definitely represented. Some people are doing what I call the return, and by that I mean they're actually becoming more orthodox. That is, they're looking back to the more ancient forms of the ritual. So I'll mention it in the Catholic Church just because it's one primary thing now. There's a big brouhaha about, are we going to do the ritual, the Mass of Vatican II, or go back and do the Latin Mass, etc. In Judaism, a lot of younger people are becoming more orthodox than their families were. And for some, it's because those rituals tend to be more involving in some sense, in all of the senses, right? There's the symbolism, there's the chanting, the music, the olfactory elements of incense for some. There are these things that nudge us and affect us on a much deeper level. And for those people, it's speaking to them, whereas the modern day version of worship without that music, without that symbols, feels kind of empty to them. Another group are those who are trying to do the ritual elements without having any larger theological element attached to it. So it's funny, you and I talked about Greg Epstein is a humanist rabbi, and he was just elected to be the chief chaplain at Harvard. For those of people who don't know, Humanistic Judaism is a small branch of Judaism where everyone is atheist, but yet they recognize the value of rituals like Shiva and Bar and Bat mitzvahs and Passover, and all of these things as markers for certain stages of life that help us through these stages, give us a cultural identity, bring us together and solidifying the groups. And so it's a way of using these tools while still saying we don't believe in a divine power. For some, it's like that. Unitarian Universalism is kind of that, but even more open. You can believe in a divine power, you don't have to, and they kind of mix and match different elements together to try and find a new way. And the third way I think people are going is basically creating something entirely new. And that may sound kind of strange, but every religion we have today started that way. Someone thought they had a better way. And the ones that go on and grow are the ones that actually speak to people and help them meet these challenges of life. And so there are ones that are trying to incorporate, spirituality with neuroscience. There are ones based on, there was a church that just folded that was based on the religion of AI, where the AI was going to become all knowing by putting together, vast amounts of knowledge on the net and figuring out what is the appropriate way to live. I'm not in favor of that, but people are trying all of these things. But I think the argument that I would make is, when we do this, if you want to succeed, what you need to do is to honor these past rituals and to use them. In some senses, they're kind of debug technologies, right? We know meditation does certain things. We know singing and chanting certain ways affects our brains and our bodies. We know all these different elements. They can be used for new purposes, but it's hard to create something new on the fly. And that's why the argument is, look to the old, but find out, using science if you want, how to adapt them in new ways.
I'm just going to shoot over. Somebody has typed a question in. Thank you for doing that. Anyone else who's welcome, that Q&A box works. You can type in your questions. Has anyone studied the effects of doing call and response or responsively reading aloud? I've seen this practice in services in several different religions.
I haven't seen call and response. I've seen work on singing together and praying together in unison. And my assumption is it would be similar for call and response. Again, anytime we put people into synchronous motion, and that can be either moving together at the same time or call and response back and forth, what this does is it makes people feel closer. It makes them feel more connected. And excuse me, not only will that make you feel more compassionate and more connected to each other, but if you're giving messages at the same time in prayer, you get kind of like a conformity effect, in the sense that we're all believing this. And the closer I feel to you, the more I want to believe what you believe, assuming I like you, and we're doing this together. And so it can then reinforce the elements, right? And so if you look at this, people will often say, well, how is this any different than a club? Right? Clubs give people social contact. Isn't that just what religion is doing if you're going to services? If you look at the newest data, what it shows is the benefits in terms of well-being and physical and mental health are beyond those of just social contact in clubs. And I think why is because these other elements work to kind of create a greater sense of community. I mean, even in our lab, right, we have people do this to music, do this kind of moving in synchrony. They don't know each other from Adam, yet from going from 16 to 50%, they're likely to go say, hey, that guy needs help. I want to help them. Take time out of my day. I feel for him. Basically, what you're doing there is creating a bond out of thin air. You add that together in lots of other elements, and what that's going to do is create a much greater influence on our feelings of connection and cohesion than just showing up once a month at, your college's alumni group or reading group or whatever it might be.
I think you kind of hit upon an interesting point here, particularly mentioning Greg Epstein, who, by the way, couldn't take part in this. I did ask him, he was too busy, but I think it's amazing. Apparently his big thing is building different types of groups and different faiths and denominations, so they've all got a conversation. But I think it's proof. He says that he's got a lot of people that don't belong to a religion or have become disenchanted with the religion they were raised in. These are young students, but they still want to be good human beings and they want to lead an ethical life. So I think that there's this need that right now doesn't seem to be being met by mainstream religion, organized religion. And we're going to talk about this a little bit more. You have a section in the book, mystics, monastics, and mushrooms. I wondered if you talk about that a little bit, about another way of trying to reach that peak experience or transcendental.
Yeah, sure. Let me say something about the being a good person first, and then I'll be happy to go into that. So you're absolutely right. I mean, one of the biggest challenges of morality, of being a good person, is being willing to sacrifice in the moment, delaying your own immediate gratification, to help others, right? That is, if you cheat, I can cheat now and I can get money, but then over time I'm hurting others and I'm hurting myself in the long run because no one will want to be with me, et cetera. But, humans, we're focused on our own immediate gratification. We're kind of built that way, but we also have to be able to be good, to be honest, to be fair, to be generous, to be patient, to be kind, because we live in a larger group. And the data actually show that people who are generous, kind, trusting, on the whole, on average, have better outcomes. Being a nice person does pay in the end. And the question is, how do we deal with that? And so again, can you be a good person without being religious or spiritual? Sure, of course you can. You can embrace ethical principles and do it. But what these rituals and practices give you are tools. So let me again give you an example. One thing we study a lot in my lab is the emotion experience of gratitude. And when we make people feel grateful, they become more honest, right? We've seen, we'll say, flip this coin in private, tell us what it came up. If it came up heads, you get a lot more money than if it came up tails. Of course, we can see what it came up on hidden camera. And people, 30, 40% of people will lie to get them more money. When we make them feel grateful, it drops to like 2 or 5%. When people feel grateful in the moment, they're more willing to help others. They're more willing to share money equitably. They're more generous. And what we're doing is by changing your emotional state, emotions exist to change what we do. And when you're feeling grateful in the same way you would pay somebody back because they did a favor, you also pay things forward. And so we tell people all the time, well, you can do gratitude journals. That will make you feel more grateful and be more ethical and be more patient. But if you look at religion, it's all over the place, right? Christians often every day say grace before they eat. It's a way of cultivating gratitude. Jews, every morning, there's the prayer, the Modi, I'm sorry if I'm pronouncing it wrong, the Modiani, which is the first thing you do when you wake up is you give thanks to God that your soul has been returned to you and that you're here on this earth. And then during the day, you're grateful for 100 different things, your clothes, your food. Now, some of that is kind of old and sexist because in the original prayers, you can say, I'm thankful that I'm a man and not a woman. So we can change the words, right, to be what they are now. And a lot of Reformed congregations do that. But it's a way of cultivating gratitude every day. And in Islam, gratitude is important, in lots of religions. And by cultivating these experiences every day, by ritualizing them, what you're doing is giving yourself a booster shot to make yourself more ethical. If you come in my lab and I say, count your blessings, and then I give you an opportunity to cheat, I have ample data time and again that you'll cheat less and you'll be more generous and be more patient. These make it ways that you do it every day so you don't forget. Your question on psychedelics, I think, is a good one. In the book, that the chapters you say is called Mystics, Monastics, and Mysticism.
Mushrooms.
Mushrooms. Thank you. Transcendence, right? Is, and I have not had one of these experiences myself, but from everything I've heard, it is an amazing state where you feel kind of connection to some people to a higher power, some people to everyone, some people to the universe at large, but is an incredibly moving experience. And there are two ways people typically get there. They're often called the right-handed route and the left-handed route. The right-handed route is the way that's kind of embedded within traditional religions. And so things like meditation. Over time, through different types of meditative activities, you can reach these stages of transcendence. Whether we're talking Hindu, Buddhist, or even Christian meditation, there's wonderful Christian mystics who talk about these experiences where they kind of melt into the Godhead, and it becomes this experience of oneness. Or you can do it the quick way, which is to the left-handed route, which is to basically take substances. So you can, psychedelics, you can drink ayahuasca, you can eat magic mushrooms, which have psilocybin in them, and have a similar experience. The interesting thing is if you look at the neuroscience behind this, longstanding meditation, the way you enter that experience of what's called ego death, where your self kind of fades away and you have this experience of connection, it causes reductions in a certain network in the brain. It's the same one that psychedelics target. And so the same thing is happening to your brain. One is through practice, one is through pharmacologic intervention. But the trick is when you're doing these pharmacological interventions is to have a guide. So oftentimes, and I've seen Michael Pollan talk about this, and I've looked at the research as well. 15 or 20% of the times people can have really bad, scary trips. When you feel ego death, when you feel yourself dissolve, that can be beautiful, moving, or it can be terrifying. And about 2% of people after these experiences actually seek psychiatric care because it was so kind of shattering to them. Now, if you do these with the shamans, right, at the time you're doing them, they are your guides. They'll be singing and chanting these in ayahuasca ceremonies. They're called icaros. And these chants, what they do is, as you chant, they create a rhythm. They slow your breathing rate. And as we slow your breathing rate, that affects your vagal nerve, which affects your heart rate, which slows it down. So when you slow your breathing down by taking deeper, slower breaths through chanting, it slows your heart rate down. That sends signals up to your brain, which basically says, okay, everything around you is safe. So normally when we feel safe, our heart rate slows. But if you artificially slow your heart rate with these techniques, it tells your brain everything is safe and calm and protected. And so when that moment of ego death comes, these rituals provide a scaffold to make sure you feel calm and you feel okay. And it makes it much more likely a positive trip. Johns Hopkins has this wonderful center led by Roland Griffiths, which studies psilocybin. And they've done work where they give people these under controlled conditions. And it's usually somebody on the team sits with them, talks with them, and stays with them. So if they're starting to have a bad trip, they'll hold their hand, they'll put it on their chest. It's someone being there to, again, scaffold you to make sure, like a shaman would do. 75% of these people report that the experience was one of the most profound experiences and meaningful experiences of their lives. A lot of people who have terminal diseases and do this suddenly report being okay with it and telling other people not to worry. And so these are tremendous tools. And we're seeing now, that the VA is now studying these as ways to deal with PTSD. The trick, though, is it's not just the medicine. It's the social scaffolding that these rituals provide around it that work together as a technology to make these things happen.
By the way, if people are interested in that, I would suggest they watch Fantastic Fungi, which is on Netflix. It's a documentary all about the amazing properties of mushrooms. And it actually goes to Johns Hopkins as part of the investigation. And this man said he came out and he's now unafraid of dying. And he's a young man. He just feels completely confident about dying. So it definitely changed his life. So it's certainly worth looking at. Okay. The pandemic has, well, I wouldn't say it's come and gone, but it's the worst of it last year. Lockdown is, for most of us here, not as bad. Certainly in sections of the country, we've got the semblance of normalcy. What data came out about prayer during the pandemic? Did anything emerge that kind of what one?
Yeah. So this is data from Pew during the worst parts of the pandemic last year. About 55%, and this is data on Americans. About 55% of people were praying frequently for better health, for the safety of their family, for the pandemic to end. But the interesting thing about that is 15% were people who report seldom or never praying before. And 24% of those are people who don't belong to any religion in particular. And so what you're seeing here again is in the face of a major challenge to life that kind of uprooted a lot of our things, people turn to religion. And again, we've heard this, religion is just the opiate of the masses. Wouldn't it be better if they were actually doing stuff? And in fact, there was a bit of a brouhaha over vaccination, because I remember Steve Pinker putting out on Twitter that, belief in the afterlife is a malignant delusion because it prevents people, he's talking about evangelicals in particular, from getting vaccines because he said they don't value life here and they'll just go on to life ever after. I don't think that's true. I think that was because of political ideology. I don't think it had anything to do with valuing life. And in fact, if you look at the data, people who are religious drink less, abuse substances less, get more nutrition, live longer, have better health. So it's not like belief in an afterlife is like nothing matters in this world, let's because it's going to be better in the next. So I think, that view is wrong. But what you're finding again is people turning to this. And I think the reason they're turning to it is because it offers tools. Belief offers tools to reduce uncertainty. Now you might say, well, Dave, isn't that silly? Not really, because when you're trying to make every decision, and we think about this, I've had this experience myself. It's like, should I go here? What's the risk here? Should I go there? What kind of mask should I wear? This is a KN95. Is that the same as an N95? What's the rate of unvaccinated people here? What's the R factor there? When you're trying to weigh everything, it can be incredibly taxing. And you want to make good and informed decisions. But at the same time, people who also, after making good informed decisions, have a sense of, okay, I'm just in some sense either going to leave it to a higher power, or if you're a Buddhist, you're going to say, I've done what I can do. The other things are out of my control. Therefore, I'm not going to worry about them. So there are different ways to not worry, whether it's a spiritual philosophy or belief in a higher power. But all of those things take the onus off of us to try and maximize every single decision to make sure we're doing something that we're not going to regret. And that causes immense amounts of stress itself. So it's not that you should be blind and not think about and not make decisions, just say, oh, everything will be fine. No, but it's a way of helping us be satisfied with the decisions we're making and to not obsess about things in a way that creates greater anxiety. But the hard part about COVID in general, too, is suddenly the ways we normally seek comfort from people, we couldn't, right? We were isolating with each other. And that raised questions of how do we connect? Even if you lost people to COVID or just during COVID, you were having funerals over Zoom. And think about what I just said about Shiva. Normally in Shiva, people sit together and they have that synchrony from praying and swaying together, and they cover their mirrors so they don't see each other. Well, when you're on Zoom, your face is right in front of you, right? And so the question is, when we have to adapt the ways that these rituals have been done because of changes to the system that we can't control, this is where science can actually help religion. I have a friend who's a rabbi, and he says to me, I want to know what science says about which of these practices and how I can adapt them will make them work better, because we were just flying by the seat of our pants, and they had to, right? We all had to during COVID. But I think it's an opportunity for science and religion to work together.
Well, I think as you've raised a couple of interesting points there. One is this whole thing of some of the things that you mentioned that are most effective and beneficial to our mental and physical health came from physical contact, from moving and swaying, from singing together, from touching. These are very human, instinctual things. And I'm wondering down the road how this virtual church thing is going to pan out in the long term.
Yeah, it's a really good, Facebook right now is really getting into the business of trying to optimize your religious mobile experience. And there are two things I worry about with that. One is if we try to tailor things too closely. So like, let's say, Mary, you decide that the perfect type of spirituality for you is, 75% Catholicism, 20% Judaism, and we throw in a few indigenous rituals there. And that makes sense to you. If we tailor things too closely, too particularly, then it's hard to have a community where we kind of all agree on how to do something in a way that kind of binds us into a community. And so part of it I worry about is in trying to optimize things individually, are we preventing the community element? And the community element isn't the only way that religion helps people live better lives, but it certainly is one. The other is what happens when we're not physically co-present with each other. So, even if you and I are just next to each other, our bodies will begin to entrain on one another. There are these wonderful rituals. Well, I shouldn't say wonderful. They're actually kind of intense pain rituals, like fire walking. And then there's one anthropologist named Demetrius Zygalatas at University of Connecticut who studies this. And what he shows is that the ritual isn't just for the person who's committing to doing the fire walking, it's for the audience as well. So when you're there, he would put sensors on people to measure their heart rate. As they're getting ready to walk across the fire, the heart and respiration rates of the person doing it and the audience begin to lock. Okay. Now they'll lock more to the extent that they know each other, but even among strangers, they begin to entrain and lock. And after they do it, and so even for the people who are watching it, it's kind of like almost this transcendent experience. Sometimes they can't even remember what else is going on. They lock into it. And afterward, they all report that they all feel like brothers and sisters, and it's community, and it's a community, just physical co-presence in that way. Even if you're not doing things together, our bodies pick up on the signals of each other. Nonverbal stuff. When we're together, you can see my face now, everybody watching, but you can't see my posture. You can't see what I'm doing with my arms, how I'm tilting. All of those things we have lots of scientific data for, affect what you think of me, what you're thinking I'm thinking of, how we're communicating, etc. Those things fall by the wayside online too. And a lot of these mechanisms rely on physiology or other ritual and symbolic nudges in space. So people, why do you kneel when you're hearing things from the altar? Or from any religious deist. There's a great study that shows if you present people information on a screen that's elevated, that's at their eye level, or that's at below them, and it's facts that they're unsure about, they tend to put more weight in the facts that are on the higher screen by a little bit. Why is that? It's because our bodies physiologically know if we're lower and we're looking up, that thing looking up means whatever we're looking at is higher in status, has more expertise. So when we kneel, whether we're Muslims kneeling for prayer or Christians kneeling in church or in other religions kneeling, the messages we're getting from on high, we're more likely to believe by a little bit. Now, I'm not saying someone's going to tell you something that's going to brainwash you. No, but for lots of these things that you're not sure where you come down on, it can shift the needle a little bit in one direction or another. It's, again, a little nudge to your mind. How's that going to work when I'm looking at the screen where I'm not kneeling, things aren't. And so all these rituals were designed for a body next to other bodies in a physical space, and they work wonderfully there. I don't know what's going to happen when we're going to be on screens.
It's going to be an interesting year for you guys to study from a psychological perspective. Okay, let me go to an article. We were talking about the state of play in the nation vis-a-vis organized religion and the moral compass. Mm-hmm. And The Economist had this really good feature piece last week on the cult of perfectionism in the young in this country. And that we have this growing sense of non-forgiveness for ourselves, never mind somebody else. I'm wondering how that translates. If you can't forgive yourself, how are you going to forgive anybody else? So because this consumption and focus on self and ego is so consuming, do you think it blurs us from the bigger picture? Is that part of it?
Yeah, I think it certainly does. And it also creates a lot of anxiety. I mean, you see this in young people now. It's not just perfectionism, what you do, but it's perfectionism in how you look, especially how you look on social media. And there's lots of work suggesting that the more time in certain ways young people spend on social media, the more anxiety provoking it might be, although there are nuances to that data. I think the ability to forgive yourself, the ability to have compassion for yourself in the sense that I'm not perfect. In two ways, this matters. One, again, it harkens back to the idea I was talking about before, which is trying to maximize every decision, trying to worry about every little thing rather than saying, I'm good enough. God loves me. My parents love me. I love me. Any ritual that makes you feel calm and good and proud of your own self, that kind of reinforces your self-worth, is good and is necessary. compassion, right? Meditation creates compassion for the self and for the world around us. And again, I'm not saying this is like some new age guru, right? I'm saying this, but we actually have data, right? So my job is to look for what I think are interesting ideas in religion and to see scientifically if they're borne out and how we can use that to help people. And we see that people have more compassion for themselves. And that's one way by which meditation reduces anxiety and messages about, how much God loves you, how important you are. And so I think one thing that people will say, well, Dave, but isn't Christianity all about how you're flawed, right? Original sin and the like. And yes, there is that element to it. But the idea behind it is that we're striving to become something better. And we're using these tools to do that. And even if you're not perfect, it's not that God disdains you, it's that God loves you. And it's the same thing in other religions as well. Even the idea of transcendence for a lot of people in Hindu experience or in indigenous experiences, that experience of transcendence is a welcoming, a connection to the divine. That's how they interpret that feeling. And that will only happen if God, if you believe in God, sees you as worthy. And lots of people talk about it as this overwhelming sense of being loved. And there's not much better feeling in the world than that. And so I think a lot of the practices and rituals are designed to help us love ourselves and love other people. And by tamping down our desire and our anxiety about being perfect and always trying to maximize our own outcomes.
A couple of questions that came in, two very different ones. One, what are the pros and cons of social media and religion? And if you've got time, somebody else has asked, what is your own personal experience with spirituality, healing, and the power of prayer?
Yeah, I think we kind of touched on the social media one. I talked about, I think, the ways that personalizing things and doing things can be problematic. My own person. So I was raised Catholic. I was an altar boy, and then I went to college, and was I going to be a religious studies major, not in a theological way, not to be a practicing minister or priest, but to kind of study world religions because I just thought it was fascinating. Or was I going to be a psychologist? And I decided I'd be a psychologist because I could run experiments and I could get data instead of just arguing about ideas about whether God exists, which I felt like God was getting me in circles. And I kind of had the hard-nosed psychologist, scientist idea, which was, I never would say that I was a hardcore atheist, but I just didn't give religion much heed. I stopped going to church. I just didn't think about it a lot. And now I'm kind of coming back to the questions that fascinated me, the questions that my work in science, what makes people happy, what makes them more ethical, et cetera, has led me back to this idea that religion isn't always just about what you believe. I mean, it is, but it's also about what you do and how you do it. And again, that's why it's living a religious life. Doing those practices are what can improve life, even if we take those practices and secularize them, right? And so where am I now in my spiritual journey? I don't know. I'd have to say I'm agnostic. I don't know what's out there. And I'm humble enough to say that. Who knows where I'll end up, but I have a newfound appreciation for the wisdom in many of these practices.
Are you familiar with Lynn McTaggart's book, The Field?
No, I'm sorry, I'm not.
Okay, so that's going to be, the question was, what does your research shed on the human experience of a common energy field? Well,
oh, that I don't know. I'm not kind of studying the physics of energy or spirituality. I'm not studying, the biologics. I mean, there's whole things in terms of traditional medicines and herbs that people take. I'm not looking at that. I'm not trying to answer theological questions. What I'm trying to do is to look at these practices to unpack how they work. So if you look at the data that shows people who are engaged in these practices regularly live longer, healthier, happier lives, I want to know why. And so my goal and what I do in this book is I look at different stages across the lifespan, from birth, new parents bonding to their babies, to how we build character, to how we become adolescents to adults, marriage and connection, health, healing, death, and loss. At each stage, how do rituals around the world work to help us do that? And how can we take some of that knowledge in a respectful way and use it? But I'm not trying to answer any theological questions about, does God exist, or is there an energy field?
I tell you what I've always wanted to look at, and I still think this is a worthwhile experiment. In this absence of organized or comparative religion being taught in high school, in my high school, we were taught all sorts of comparative religions just to examine, and people came in from all different backgrounds and talked about what they believed in, which was very interesting. But in the absence of that here, I think it would be fascinating to actually teach ethics, because it isn't being taught in schools. And I think that relying on sort of some ad hoc bit of good luck that a person is going to suddenly adopt good practices, or how to be a good citizen, basically.
I think that's absolutely right. And, traditionally, right, whether you were, going to whatever religious education you did as a child, whatever your tradition was, part of that would be ethics education. It was often what you should do, and it was these other tools that actually helped you do it. But I think you're absolutely right. I teach this course so I'm a professor at Northeastern University. I teach this course called The Moral Mind, which is open to anyone, and it's usually a giant lecture hall filled with people. Where it's my job isn't to tell you what your ethics should be, but I see it as my job, psychologically speaking, to take each of these ethical issues and show you how your mind works and what levers push it one way or the other. So that way, once you choose what is your ethics, or what are your ethics, you know how your mind works. Because we have this work. We study people all the time, and I'll ask them, even anonymously, would you cheat in this type of situation? And 100 people will say no. 100% of people will say no. It's one of the few rare times you get ethics. You get, unanimity in a response. Then I put them in the experiment. I give them anonymity, and 75% of them cheat, right? And I don't think it's because they're lying. I think it's because they don't think they would cheat, but when push comes to shove, they often convince themselves of why it was okay this time. And so my job is scientifically to explain what those pressures are and how your mind goes about making these decisions and even fooling yourself, so that you can prepare yourself and be ready. And I see religion as providing tools. And what I'm talking about really are these tools are kind of like vaccines. If you do them regularly, you will be more ethical. You will be more kind. You might have more connection and even more transcendent experiences and less grief, right? They help you through life. And so, I completely agree with that ethics should be taught in one way or another, even better from multiple perspectives.
Well, believe it or believe it not, Dave, our hour is almost up. So I want to thank you so much for talking about all this research that went into your book. Once again, there's a link on the website for people to order it through Brookline Booksmith. Support your local bookshop. Thank you. This was a conversation with David DeSteno, who is a professor at Northeastern, psychologist. And the book is How God Works, the Science Behind the Benefits of Religion.